It is now my pleasure to turn the webcast over to Dr. Peter Hurst, Executive Director, MIT Sloan Executive Education. Dr. Hurst, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Russell. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in our new webinar series at MIT Sloan Executive Education, titled Innovation at Work. We have over 1,300 people who have registered for this first webinar, so welcome to you all. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the topic and introduce our speaker. Our speaker for this webinar is Stephen Spear. Stephen is a senior lecturer in our executive education program at the MIT Sloan School, and he has been researching for many years questions about how some organizations and companies are able to perform far and above other competitors in their field. Stephen has been teaching a program for us in our executive education portfolio on this topic, and that's entitled High Velocity Organizations, hence the topic of this webinar. And with that, Stephen, perhaps I could ask you, what is a high velocity organization?
All right. Well, Peter, thanks for the question, and thanks to everybody for tuning in today. So, very simply, high velocity organizations typically are those which are dealing with very complex situations, both in the terms of the product and service they bring to market and the systems on which they depend to do so. They're typically in very highly competitive industries and sectors, and despite the highly competitive nature of their setting, they still perform extraordinarily well, and they do so by outracing the field, and hence the term high velocity. I'll elaborate a little bit on that and compare this notion of competing by velocity versus some conventional wisdoms about how competitive advantage is generated. So the key point, as I just flashed through here, is that in highly competitive environments, you have to compete on the speed with which you make new discovery, and not necessarily the defensibility of a position you have. So again, to set this up against some conventional wisdom, it's often the case that we can look within an industry. It might be autos, telecommunications, aerospace, could be a service industry like hospitality, restauranting, whatever else it happens to be. And we see that there are one or two, but very few organizations which they just score off the charts on just about everything important. It could be quality, workplace safety, if that's a concern, cost, time to market, responsiveness to changes in market need, product portfolio diversity, whatever it happens to be. And while they stand out across these many measures, there's a large pack of competitors who really seem to struggle to keep up. Now, oftentimes when people make the observation that there's a standout in a field, then they go through some process in a sense of benchmarking, trying to understand what separates the standout from the rest of the pack. And oftentimes, the answer to the question, what causes this real differentiation in performance, is the answer that there must be some kind of difference in tools, techniques, technology, which explain the difference. Now, this notion that the differences are tools and techniques, I'll elaborate on one example. I got to MIT first as a graduate student in the 1980s, when the big issue was about beating Japan, and for the very simple reason that Japanese companies were doing such a marvelous job at disrupting American companies, again, across a whole broad range, heavy industry like steel manufacturing, fiber optics later on, and certainly the automotive industry. And the automotive industry, when people started comparing auto company to auto company, and even at a more finer grained level, auto plant to auto plant, they made the observation that certain facilities with half the people, half the space, half the time, half the resources on hand, were able to generate twice the output on any given day. So it was really half in, twice out. And with that observation of half in, twice out, and for those of you familiar with it, this is where this term lean production came in, because the folks doing that research noticed that in a world of mass production, there was a certain population or subpopulation able to generate twice the value with half the effort. And they said, well, if everyone else is massive, these folks must be lean. And then there was a follow-on set of studies to try and understand what was characteristic of lean organizations. And when people started taking a look at these comparing the lean to the mass producers, they noticed that there were differences in tools and technologies and techniques. So, for example, whereas a scheduled production was typical in the mass production setting, pull production or just-in-time was characteristic of lean. Whereas things like, say, lack of discipline or improvisation or personalization of how work was done was characteristic in the mass production setting. Standard work, much more highly routinized, choreographed, may be a better way to say it, but a choreographed approach to doing work was more characteristic in the lean environment. And so, what was observed was really profound differences in performance, and the cause for those differences in performance were attributed to differences in tools and techniques. Now, let me just offer that that's an operational example, but it fits in so well with the conventional wisdom of how success accrues to organizations. Because the conventional wisdom reinforced by much typical management education is that the job of managers is to make decisions by which their organizations achieve success. And just to elaborate on this point briefly, if you think about the core curriculum for most MBA programs, you start off with something, let's say, like finance, which is a set of disciplines, a set of approaches on how to value decisions. Accounting, of course, is a set of tools and techniques on how to keep track of decisions. Strategy, for the longest time, has been taught as a decision science. So the way strategy is typically thought is senior leaders of an organization do an analysis to evaluate whether the position of their organization is weak or strong. If they if they decide that it's in a weak position, they make a set of decisions to migrate it to a strong position. And once they've migrated to a strong position, the assumption is that they've now achieved a differentiation which is somehow protected. So anyway, there's a lot of conventional wisdom which reinforces this notion that the job of managers, and particularly senior leaders of organizations, is to make decisions which will get to a point of competitive advantage. Now, with that as the dominant general conventional wisdom, the notion that great success by these operational measures of quality, cost, safety, cycle time, and so on and so forth, the conclusion that those distinctions are due to the decisions about which tools and techniques to use, it makes perfect sense given the conventional wisdom. The problem with that conclusion, though, is it's not supported by the data. And so if we consider the experience across industries, it's not so much that we can identify a single tool or technique or decision which separates the great organizations from those stuck in the pack. More to the point, what we see is that there's a history by which those who lead today have simply outraced the field. And sometimes those who are ahead today actually started way behind the field, but it was the pace by which they improved what they were doing, innovated what they were doing, essentially outlearned and outdiscovered the competition, which got them to the privileged position they enjoy in the moment. So I'll give an example of that, but just to anchor this in terms of the metaphors by which we think through our comparison, the metaphor of snapshots gets us to thinking that if we just take a look today and compare the pictures in front of us, we'll see the differences in tools and techniques. But more to the point, what we see is if we run a videotape and see the difference in behavior between the leaders and the rest, that's where we really start to gain some critical insights as to what separates the leaders from the followers. It's not so much the tools and techniques which are used on a particular day, it's the behaviors by which ever greater value is generated with ever less effort that we have to focus on. Now, I'll certainly get to talk about what those behaviors are and how they differ between the high-velocity leaders and the rest of the pack. Let me just offer a few examples as to what this outracing the field looks like. So as I mentioned, when I got to MIT Sloan in the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, there was a tremendous amount of attention paid to the auto industry, in particular because two companies, Toyota and Honda, were really decimating the remainder of the industry, and particularly the big three automakers. And the snapshot metaphor and leading to benchmark comparisons got people thinking that it must be the tools and techniques of lean production which were the source of competitive advantage for these two companies. But here's the thing, is that when you look at the data, you realize that Toyota wasn't always the leader. In fact, they were not only not the leader, they were a really poor auto company. So when I'm in front of an audience or with a class, I ask people if they're familiar with the Model T, and everyone, of course, raises their hand because it was one of the great product introductions by the Ford people. And I ask people if they know the Volkswagen Beetle, and of course, everyone raises their hand because they're familiar with what was just a phenomenal product introduction by the Volkswagen people, or the Sony Walkman, for that matter, a great product introduction in the consumer electronics field. Then I say, well, how about Toyota's first product in the U.S. market, which was something called the Toyota Toyopet. And without doubt, no one in the class or in the audience has ever heard and let alone seen a Toyopet, though everyone is tremendously familiar with what a Beetle or a Model T look like. And of course, the reason no one is familiar with the Toyopet, it was a simply awful car. Toyota brought the Toyopet to the U.S. market in the late 1950s, and for obvious reasons of shipping convenience, tried to sell these cars first in California. And the Toyopet had the unusual distinction that if you had to get to the top of a hill, the odds of getting to the top of the hill, again, no guarantee that you'd actually get there, it's just the probability. The probability of getting to the top of the hill was greater in reverse than in forwards. And as you know, California has quite a big number of hills. I suppose if they had gone to Kansas, it might have been a better new product introduction, but getting to the top of the hill in reverse in California was a real deal breaker. So Toyota sold very, very few of these cars, took the remainder back to Japan, and it's one of these good news, bad news things because while the bad news might be that Toyota couldn't sell many cars, the good news is they couldn't sell many cars because they weren't very good at making these cars. So the data shows that in the 1958-1959 timeframe, Toyota's productivity was about 1/8 that of their American counterparts. And this is not simply labor productivity. You might say that in 1958, not that long after World War II, Toyota and the rest of Japanese industry was short capital. Everything, no matter where you measured productivity, it was 1/8 that of the U.S. automakers. So that's 58, 59. By 1962, the data shows, though, that Toyota had closed the productivity gap, again on labor and capital and every combination by which you can mix those, and was on par with the rest of the world in auto industry. That's 1962. By 1968, Toyota was twice as productive. And when Toyota came back to the U.S. market in 1973, this was when OPEC had raised dramatically the price of petroleum and gasoline. Toyota showed up with these cars, which were very, very affordable because of the tremendous gains in productivity it had achieved over the previous decade. Well, now the initial appeal of these cars into the U.S. market was a combination of affordability, both in terms of sticker price, but also at the gas pump. Because they were small and fuel efficient, you didn't need to fill them quite as often. But what really caught the attention of American auto buyers was that not only were these cars affordable and fuel efficient, they were tremendously reliable. And Peter, I don't know if you remember this growing up, but the cliche when I was a kid was that you could tell where someone parked their car by the oil and other fluid stains on the driveway. And when people started buying these Toyota cars, they realized that they wouldn't have stains on the driveway because they simply didn't leak fluids all the time. So anyway, this combination of affordable reliability became the invitation for Toyota to not only enter the U.S. market with these fuel-efficient compact cars, but with mid-sized cars and large cars and eventually trucks and SUVs and minivans. And so this was part of the catch up and then outrace the field on quality and productivity, and then model variety. And then with the realization that it was starting to saturate the mid-market with the Toyota brand, Toyota had two very successful new product introductions in the form of Lexus in the luxury end of the market and the Scion for the youth market. And there's some very interesting stories about innovation and how Toyota discovered the configuration and the value proposition around those two brands. In an era when people have been repeatedly arguing about how to raise fuel economy, Toyota was way out ahead in terms of this hybrid drive system, with initially doubling fuel economy on the Prius relative to similarly sized cars. And it's kind of interesting. So President Obama, as the single largest shareholder in General Motors, has been touting the Chevy Volt as the next generation automobile. There was a problem with these batteries catching fire, and Chevy had to do a recall on the Volt. And I'll give you the number, but I just encourage the listeners to think about how many of these Volts got recalled. Pick a number. Was it 100,000, 50,000, 25,000? Well, you're coming up with that. The answer is 6,000 cars got recalled. And to put that in some context, 6,000 cars is about a day or two's worth of production out of a typical auto assembly plant. So it's not an awful lot. In comparison, in Toyota's experience with this hybrid drive, they've introduced some 6 generations already on the hybrid drive technology. It's across some 3 million different automobiles on the road, and in models across the Toyota and the Lexus line. So again, back to this particular example in the auto industry, people's attention was drawn to Toyota and Honda to a large extent on this phenomenon of much more value generated with much less effort exerted than anyone else in the industry. And the initial interpretation of this was differences in tools and techniques, the tools of lean manufacturing, for example, perhaps better use of robots or other automation. But the thing about tools and techniques as an explanation is it doesn't really get to explain the differences in rates of improvement and rates of innovation and rates of discovery. And that stuff about discovery is not rooted in tools and techniques. It's really rooted in behavior. And what I'd like to discuss is what our research and our practice has shown about differences in behavior and the huge impact they can have on the performance of an organization.
Thanks, Steve. Before we move on, one question. You just described the experience of a couple of Japanese manufacturing companies in the automotive industry. Perhaps people are quite familiar in some cases with those names and those stories. Do you have any other examples of either in that industry but people are less familiar with, or even in other industries, including service industries?
Yeah, so it's a marvelous question because this story about autos, were only autos, this phenomena of exceptional performance won through incredible rates of improvement and innovation. If it were only autos, it would be an interesting story. And I think interesting for people of a certain age, and for everyone else it would probably be an interesting but somewhat dated story because autos seem so passé these days. But it turns out exactly the same storyline is true even if you change the names and the costumes of the characters. So in the world of heavy industry, you can imagine anytime you're taking raw materials, exerting these heavy industrial processes of mining, refining, smelting, that sort of thing on them, you're creating a workplace which is hostile and threatening to human well-being. And in fact, that's typically the case, that if you put people in an environment with very big, powerful machines and material which is heavy and hot and fast-moving, surrounded by caustic chemicals, people do get hurt. Now, the exception to the rule there is DuPont and Alcoa. And in the case of Alcoa, where I picked that because I'm familiar with the organization, know the data a little better than DuPont, the odds of getting hurt on the job in American manufacturing overall is about 2% a year. So to give that some sense, run down a list of people who you work with, find the first 100 names on that list, and pick 2 at random. Those are the 2 people who get hurt in the next 12 months. Now, if you were to do the same exercise at Alcoa, pick a list of 100 people, there's a pretty good chance that no one on the list will get hurt because their odds of getting hurt on the job are 0.07% a year. So orders of magnitude less than what is typical in industry. Now, when we look at Alcoa, we could fall into exactly the same trap, saying that there was something about thoughtful, wise, charismatic leadership where they made the right decisions, be it around technology acquisition, around incentive systems, that people just stopped getting hurt at Alcoa. In fact, the data is completely inconsistent with sort of that conventional wisdom explanation of the right decisions. And what we see at Alcoa is that over a 10-year period, a very, very steady flow of people seeing problems that presented threat and risk, solving those problems that presented threat and risk, and then incorporating these newfound learnings and discoveries systemically, so that even if you had an insight, it's useful to the rest of us. And so that Alcoa is a very different operating environment than Toyota for sure, but also characterized by very, very high performance on not only safety but a lot of other operational metrics achieved through these very high rates of learning and discovery. Now, also staying in the world of manufacturing, I'll give some service examples. But in the world of manufacturing, if you take a look at Intel, also enormously technologically complex environment, extraordinarily competitive industry. So complex operating environment, competitive, very competitive industry environment. And you take a look at Intel, and what they've done, the performance metric that matters in that industry is chip speed achieved by the density by which you can pack stuff onto a microprocessor. And one might think that Intel also has a particular insight due to a set of technological or incentive or hiring decisions on the part of their leadership. But in fact, Intel is in an industry where the product they sell, once it goes out the door, could be commoditized because the people who use these chips may be less picky about which chip they're using so long as it's fast enough and has the appropriate processing on it. To make these chips, Intel sources equipment from exactly the same vendors as anybody else in the industry. I mean, if you had $10 million in your pocket, you could buy exactly the same equipment Intel has. The difference is what happens inside the factories by which they take exactly the same equipment available to everybody else and learn how to use that equipment better, faster than anyone else, so they can squeeze far more devices in far less space than anyone else. And I've got some examples on healthcare organizations discovering their way to greatness, but this phenomenon is not limited to autos. It's not limited to autos, which is why it goes from being interesting entertainment to interesting it might actually matter to me.
Great. Thank you, Steve. So I think we're all interested. You really set out what the nature of the challenge is, the problem that we're trying to solve. So tell us, what is the secret sauce? Yeah,
so I'll give you the secret sauce, but around this motivation, let me run through two quick examples, and then I'll get into really the fundamental behavioral differences and why they matter so much. So I was talking about this world of very competitive, high-tech manufacturing. So let me give an example there. So this is kind of the story like the little engine that could, the little piece of machinery where you feel sorry for its plight in life. So this is the little fab, the little microprocessor factory that could. So the story here is that there's a facility that makes semiconductors, and this was really the ugly duckling of, I guess I'm mixing my metaphors of the pack. I don't know what that group of geese is. But anyway, it was the ugly duckling in the pack. And the reason for that is that in an industry which was migrating to more advanced technology, it was penalized by older technology. It was owned by a company which had acquired this manufacturing facility really as the afterthought in a corporate transaction which was really largely about IP. And they ended up with this because it sort of came along for the ride. It's kind of like when you're wooing somebody and you meet their sibling, and it's like, all right, yeah, we can invite the sibling along for along for the ride? So it's kind of like that. And so there's a lot of, the facility was smaller than they typically would have built a facility. It was located in a way they never would have located a facility. Ugly Duckling. And the one thing that was absolutely sure is that being the ugly duckling, not only in this corporation, but in the industry as a whole, the life expectancy on this facility, and consequently the life expectancy on the 1,300 jobs it provided, was pretty darn short. The folks in that facility recognized that unless they could create far more value with much less effort, they weren't going to be viable. They went exactly the path the conventional wisdom would have taken them. They went out, they got the consultants, they came in, they got the lean stuff, the Six Sigma stuff, the TQM stuff, and while it helped them get somewhat better, the problem is they weren't good enough. And then the folks who were leading that organization started looking around and they asked themselves a very simple question. On any given day, the value we extract out of our people and out of our equipment, is that anywhere close to the theoretical limit? We anywhere close at all? And they looked around and they just looked at the amount of downtime on people, downtime on equipment, confusion by people, wasted resources, and they said, no, there's stuff going on in here which is simply putting us so far from what is theoretically possible that our real problem is that we're not being attentive to the problems, the obstacles, the impediments that get in our way. We're not solving on those things. And because we're not solving on those things, there are discoveries which we simply can't incorporate into our daily work. So the profound difference was that the folks in this facility said, it used to be our daily work was generating wafers. Now our daily work is going to generate wafers and generate identification of the things that make that work hard and generate new approaches to doing our work so those obstacles and those impediments go away. So to give you a sense of what happens when over the course of about a year, your daily work is not generating is generating not just physical product, but generating new insights. So over the course of about a year, they took their throughput time down by some 70%. Now the thing to understand in the electronics industry, well, we all know it. The friend or the relative who was online for the latest version of the iPad, I'm pretty sure Apple would have sold it to them 2, 3, 4 days later or a week later. But there's a segment of that consumer base which needs things right away. And so if you can promise to people making electronic things that you can get it out the door in 30% of the time compared to everyone else, demand just for your productive capacity goes off the charts. And the good news is, as they got into this habit, this daily habit of seeing what was problematic and how they did their work, solving on those problems, and incorporating those new discoveries, not only did their throughput go down dramatically, but their productive capacity went up by 25%. Along with that, yields went up, quality went up, because they were getting so much more value out of exactly the same resource base. Their unit cost declined by some 50%. Now, here's the thing. This story of the Ugly Duckling, which had this very, very short life expectancy, that goes back about 8 years. And, if you went back about 8 years and said, how much longer does this plant have, the answer would have been 6 months, 12 months, maybe 18 months with a sort of an delusional optimism. And that plant is still up and running because it is still setting world standards in terms of value created relative to effort generated. So anyway, that's one example. Another example, you'd asked me earlier, is this just an auto thing? So no, the answer is no. We see it in autos. We see it in this high-tech, high-risk manufacturing environment. But let me give you an example in the world of healthcare. Now, I'll just guide the listeners through this chart a little bit. Key points here. Just look at the bottom line, deaths. And that's certainly the motivator here. And let me now describe the context. So the situation in which these deaths was occurring were intensive care units at a hospital called Allegheny General Hospital in Pittsburgh. And the reason these deaths were occurring is that people in intensive care often get a procedure called a central line. What a central line is it's essentially just a tube snaked in through the circulatory system so you can drop medication right at the heart and get it through the body very quickly. The thing is, when you put a tube into a vein, what you're doing is creating a highway for bacteria, And as you can see from the data of the some 1,700 patients who got these central lines in any given year, a large portion of them got infections, and of those, a very large portion died as a result of those infections. Now, to put this in some larger context, there's some 250,000 of these central line infections experienced every year. The mortality on these is about 20–25%. So we're talking a death rate due to a medical complication on par with auto and accident-related deaths. And even when the deaths don't occur, the cost of treating someone who's suffered one of these central line infections runs into the tens of thousands of dollars. So this is a huge, huge problem. Now, the thing for the folks in Pittsburgh is that at first they thought that despite the number of deaths that they were experiencing in their units, that it was somewhat unavoidable. And again, it's these conventional wisdom problems we have, which is you're dealing with some very sick people. That's why they're in the hospital. And in fact, even sicker still, which is why they're in intensive care. And sicker beyond that, which is why they're getting a central line. So the fact that they're so weak and vulnerable is not surprising that they get infections and suffer horribly from them. What happened is that the fellow who's in charge of these intensive care units, a friend and colleague of mine named Rick Shannon, he started getting uncomfortable with this because he kept attending graduations from medical school, and the doctors, before they get whatever they get, their stethoscopes and whatnot, they raise their hand and take the Hippocratic oath of first do no harm. And he was starting getting really quite uncomfortable with the amount of harm being done. It was hypocrisy, but not like the Hippocratic oath intended. And when he started going beyond the data, in this obscure data of infection per 1,000 line days, and started putting some names and faces onto the deaths, it was just shocking to the staff there. So, Rick shared a story. I've heard him tell us, and it brings a tear every time I hear it, about a young woman who was suffering from cancer, but being treated successfully. She was 24 years old, had a little daughter, but the disease was in remission. And everything was looking absolutely positive and rosy, that the miracle of modern science and modern medical technology was going to alleviate her from this curse. Yet in the course of getting treated, she got one of these central lines, got a central line infection, and instead of being able to go home and provide loving care to her child, ended up with this horrible hospice experience till she died, at a very young age, leaving a motherless child behind. And Rick started sharing these stories, and people started to realize, this is just insane. This is not why we became doctors, nurses, pharmacists, technicians, administrators in healthcare. And so then they started asking the question, well, what's the problem and what's the solution? Now, again, I think this through. The conventional wisdom is it's a tool, a technique, or a technology. So the tool, technique, technology approach is, instead of catheters, what we need is silver-coated catheters because they're less conducive to having bacteria travel along them. Or we need different types of antibiotics. So that's we're going to try and think our way to the right answer approach. But as the staff started reflecting, they said, it might be tools, techniques, and technology, but son of a gun, we throw so many obstacles into our way on a daily basis that make it hard to take care of patients. And just running through some examples, they realized that they had this problem that on night shift, the residents on call would place a line rather than what's the safer approach up near the collarbone. They would do a femoral placement, which is putting this tube, this catheter up through someone's crotch. And it's probably not surprising to anyone that's probably more infection prone. And when they started asking the question why that was happening, they said, well, the folks who got the short straw to be on call at night were the junior residents who hadn't been trained up on the safer but more nuanced, tactily difficult approach of putting one of these central lines by the collarbone. So they faced a dilemma. Either take the risk of putting it in by the collarbone, don't do it at all, which was an unacceptable alternative, or put it in around the leg and hope for the best. And so they realized that they hadn't really thought through who was being assigned at night and the training necessary to be left alone and responsible on call at night. So they had a longer-term approach of changing their training and their credentialing for who could be on it at night. But what they also came up with is an idea that if someone did place a femoral line at night, that it would be moved in the morning by a more experienced fellow who is a specialist in intensive care. But even that approach, they found that it occasionally broke down because the fellow might not know that a femoral line had been placed at night. For instance, if the fellow is examining a patient, head and shoulders, she might not notice that a femoral line had been placed on an area which was draped in the morning. So they had to come up with 1 and 2 and 3 different ways of establishing a reliable signal from night shift to day shift that a line had to be replaced. And as they continued to watch this, and then they came up with more reliable procedures for placing lines, they realized that there was a lot of difficulty thrown at the nurses who were responsible for changing these lines. And so it took more effort to observe the work, see the problems that occurred in the work, and solve on those problems, then systematizing and making routine the discoveries they made around the individual work, so that not only was placing lines both easier and less risky, so easier and higher value, maintaining lines was easier and less risky, easier and higher value. And that led to the beautiful result that what was a highly risky experience for patients when they baselined this in 2003, 19 deaths out of all those lines placed. Within 2-3 years, they had taken the infection rate down dramatically and the death rate down to 0. So an organization which was working very, very hard and providing compromise value actually was able to work easier and provide far expanded value. And like with the folks in this semiconductor fab, so you think about the similarities and differences. So differences, product to market, wildly different, technology used, wildly different, professional training of employees, wildly different, but behaviorally, exactly the same behaviors, which was on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, on a minute by minute, start with the humility that the work you're doing is compromised because what you're doing is incredibly complex and incredibly demanding. Start with that humility, then motivated by that humility, very aggressively look for the small inconveniences as signals of something more fundamentally flawed in the design of the systems. When you see those problems, quickly swarm them to solve them. And when those problems are solved, make also part of your daily work, incorporating what's learned into tomorrow's work. And again, here are a few examples, but of a larger phenomenon that if you do this behavioral change, not the technology tool technique change, but this behavioral change, you can discover your way to much, much better performance than you might have thought possible, and certainly much better than your rivals and peers and counterparts think possible.
Thank you, Steve. So we have a few questions, I think, about you describing the need for behavioral change. But to many people, we've perhaps been here before. How is this different to Lean or Six Sigma or any other of these management techniques that we've heard about over the years?
Right. So it's a marvelous question. So it really gets back to this difference is exceptional performance. And again, define exceptional performance by what is relevant in your industry. Is exceptional performance the consequence of decisions or discoveries? So if you're in the mindset that exceptional performance is the consequence of decisions, then what you do as a leader is you go out and buy stuff. So you buy fancy software, you buy fancy hardware. If you need reconfiguration of your systems, you hire experts to do that. On the other hand, if your conviction is that exceptional performance is gained not through deciding your way to the right answer, but discovering your way to the right answer, then your posture as a senior leader really changes fundamentally, because your daily work shifts from deciding where to allocate resources. Of course, that's still important. Resources are scarce, demands are infinite, so you have to make decisions about how you use resources. But your daily work now has to shift quite dramatically to teaching people within your organization this triplet of seeing problems that impede their efforts, solving those problems in a disciplined enough fashion to gain new insight in how to do the work, and how to share what they've discovered so that a local discovery is systemically and broadly applicable. Now, you asked specifically about these other quality movements over the many years, and I encourage those folks who are familiar with them to ask the question, what is the imposition or what is the requirement for senior leaders around those various quality programs? And I think what many of us realize when we reflect is that many of those quality programs ask the senior leaders to make decisions, to set standards, to set goals, to set objectives, and then to commit resources in pursuit of those. Very few of those in general, and certainly very few of those in practice, ask senior leaders to cultivate an environment in which people are constantly discovering problems, constantly experimenting on their way to creating good new answers, solutions to those problems, and constantly learning and teaching so that the local discovery has broad impact.
So this is significantly about creating culture and creating a new culture in organizations in order to become a high-velocity organization. Culture is a very long-term project often. So,
right.
I'm sitting here buying into what you're selling me, but what can I do tomorrow or today even to begin that process?
Yeah.
How to make this practical?
Right. So so making it practical. I'm glad you asked that question because after all, MIT is fundamentally a practical place. On the one hand, we have a lot of great theory around here, but if you wander our halls, you look at people who have great theory for because they're highly motivated to come up with practical answers to real problems. And so it's a good question. So here's the thing: is if first of all, let me just offer that the word culture is sometimes misleading to people because it has sort of this touchy-feely kind of kumbaya, let's go all have cotton candy kind of feel to it. And it really is, and the truth is, I think that sense of what culture is does a disservice to the word. Because what culture is a set of consistent responses by a group of people to a set of situations. And so responses and behavior is really the issue here, and what you're trying to do is fundamentally shift how people behave or respond in a set of circumstances or situations. And I think perhaps the most profound way to do that is for senior leaders to change the conversation. So the conventional wisdom, again, around when the conventional wisdom is anchored in senior leaders decide our way to greatness, the conversations then are, I've made a decision, did you carry it out? And that leads us into all sorts of, I've made a decision, now I command it onto you, now we're going to have mechanisms for control, we'll have auditing around that to make sure that there's compliance. And that gets all sorts of conversation in that direction. However, if the wisdom or the belief is that greatness is discovered, then the daily conversation, senior leaders to those for whom they're responsible, has to change from what did you accomplish to what did you learn. And it's significant and deliberate that when I picked these two very disparate examples, one from high-tech, high-risk manufacturing and the other from high-tech service healthcare, that I mentioned the senior leaders of the organization taking charge of this because they had to change the conversation. So it no longer was my friend Rick Shannon saying, how many patients did we treat today and how did we do? Important conversation to have. But Rick had to have the daily conversation with the other doctors, with the nurses and the other members of the healthcare professional staff saying, what got in your way? And then expand the conversation to say, from complaint to what got in your way to diagnosis. Why do you think it got in your way? To go from complaint to diagnosis to what got in your way, why do we think it got in your way, to what can we do, treatment, so it doesn't get in your way tomorrow or next week or next month, depending on the size of the thing that got in your way. and where else can we apply this, by whom can we teach, and what else got discovered elsewhere. So Rick Shannon had to fundamentally change his daily, hourly, minute-by-minute conversation he had with his colleagues, and likewise, the leader at the semiconductor fab, he too had to change his conversation from how many wafers did we process today to how many problems did we have in processing those problems, and what have we done to understand why those problems presented themselves, and what can we do to make them go away.
Okay, thank you. So just looking at some of the questions that we have coming in. One I see is sort of an interesting take on this, and going back to your, just briefly, if you were, to the healthcare example. I guess the question is, how do you differentiate between something which is really transforming the performance of the organization versus merely catching up to what perhaps you should have expected to be the sort of normal professional standards or behavioral standards that anybody who's just reasonably competent working in that organization?
Yeah, no, it's a marvelous question. You know, how do you compare standards versus improved? So, let me use the healthcare example. So, the two are related. What's the professional standard, and what's the behavior around achieving it? So, this is the experience my friend Rick Shannon had, and other colleagues I have who work in this healthcare space, which is there are a tremendous number of standards. What medication, well, first of all, what tests to run to determine the causality of symptoms and problems, what medication or what are treatments to provide onto that. Those are the standards. And in fact, here's a particular example. There's a guy named, out at Intermountain Healthcare in Salt Lake City. So they had all these professional standards of how also you treat patients in an intensive care setting. The question was delivering on those standards. So someone in intensive care, for example, a very important control parameter is blood sugar level. Keep that nailed to whatever the target is, and the patient has a much higher probability of a good outcome than a bad outcome. On the other hand, if that wobbles all over, it's a very dire foreshadowing of complication. So they had all sorts of professional standards on what those levels should be around blood sugar and all sorts of other things. They had actually some very solid clinical evidence on tools and techniques to maintain towards those standards. The problem was that that was all theoretical. The question was, what in the operating environment prevented them from doing what was theoretically recommended and clinically desirable? And what they ended up doing under the guidance of this fellow, Terry Clemmer at LDS Hospital in Salt Lake City, was same thing as Rick and same thing as at this fab, which was change the conversation from what should we be doing to why can't we? And once we've identified why can't we, right? You know, what's keeping us from the standard, and then what are the causes in our operating environment which prevent that, which create the obstacle, and what can we do differently? And to give you a sense of the changing conversation, this fellow Terry Clemmer, he created or led the creation of some very sophisticated protocols on how to tend to patients in this intensive care setting. He's come up with new techniques. When people have approached Terry and said, Terry, you know, what are the techniques can we use? And he's very free to offer them. They're on his website and on the website of LDS Hospital. He says, the thing you got to understand is my techniques won't work for you. My protocols won't work for you. And I've seen him do this in an audience. There must have been 500 people in the room, Peter. And everyone's like shocked. It's like, you know, you built your reputation on these protocols for maintaining the health of intensive care patients. You're talking about these protocols, and now you're saying they won't work. And what Terry goes on to say is that here's the thing. We started with the best evidence-based what the best evidence-based medicine told us to do. We tried to do it, and we couldn't. But what we did is on a daily basis, we tried to figure out why we couldn't and what we could do differently to adhere to what the evidence said we should be doing. We did that every single day, and we taught everyone who came into our units how to do exactly the same thing. And he says, so here's the deal. You can try my protocols, but it's like trying on my suit. The suit looks good on me. It'll ill fit you because the secret is not the suit, it's the tailor. And he said, if you want a suit to look as good on you as my suit looks on me, you've got to tailor the suit to you by seeing problems, solving problems, and making sure that the process is getting better and better in response to all that.
Great, great. So I've been, thank you, Steve. I've been trying to keep track of a large number of questions that have been coming through as we've been having this conversation. And perhaps as we just begin to wrap up, if I may play devil's advocate for a moment and try to represent sort of one strand of questions that have been coming through, which would be, what are the, as you think about this sort of this theory and this work that you've been describing, and I appreciate it's a very large body of work, where do you think that the weaknesses or challenges that could come from to your concept of high velocity organizations?
Right. So the weaknesses and challenges. So there's a lot of opportunity for this type of behavior, and in fact, a lot of need for it, if that's what you mean. So it runs into this conventional wisdom problem, which is, for many decades and generations, we've told people who lead organizations that with a sufficient collection of data and a sophisticated analysis of it, they could arrive at the right decision. That might have once been true. When the work we did was relatively simple, we could have a visualization of the system. And even if it wasn't so simple, if it was fairly slow-moving, either the systems that changed or the environment in which we operated, if those were slow-moving, even if we didn't get the right answer on the first decision, we had chances to decide our way iteratively to the right answer. But that opportunity has largely disappeared. And let me just give you let me pull up a slide and give you an example of exactly this phenomena. So, you'll indulge me, let's click through right here. Here we go. I was having a conversation with someone who runs a very large facility which does very complex chemical processing. And got a conversation of what makes his daily work hard. And he said it's really something. It used to be if someone had a good idea, like generation 1 on a slide, they'd have a good idea. We'd go through this shallow ramp of bringing that idea in practice, and then we'd get to enjoy some steady state based on the hard work we've done. And then here was the problem, is that the market grew increasingly competitive. More people entered our line of work. Our line of work was being done not only here domestically but overseas. And so there was a real compelling competitive imperative to, when we had a good idea, bring it online faster, so a steeper ramp, but then a competitive imperative to bring on the next generation of a product, service, and process technology too. And he said, we're finally at the point with generation 4 where if you have a good idea, we have to ramp so quickly and get ready for the next generation also with such a short lead time that there's no steady state. And he said, we fundamentally shifted from being an organization which does high volume manufacturing. And he said it still looks that way because every day trucks arrive with raw materials and other trucks leave with finished product. It still looks like we're doing high volume manufacturing. But he said, in fact, we're no longer doing high volume manufacturing because there's simply no steady state. He said, what we're really doing is we're doing high volume problem solving. We're doing high volume engineering. And this is exactly the competitive challenge today, which is whether you pick high-tech, high-risk, or advanced services like healthcare or advanced design, whatever it is, the world moves very, very quickly, and the systems that have to move are very, very complex. And it's no longer possible for, almost in a think tank fashion, for a bunch of sophisticated, wise gurus to do all the experimentation, learning, and discovery, and then have the rest of us poor bumpkins just adhere to what they've discovered and what they've decided for us to do. And you see this in this organization. The number of people who have to actively be part of the discovery process has gone up at least an order of magnitude, maybe 2, in his organization. Certainly true with my friend Rick Shannon in the healthcare setting, and true just across the board. So the real stumbling point will be not so much that the need for relentless discovery is needed. There's no turning back that clock. Nor that it's possible and rooted in behavior. The real impediment is leaders, particularly senior leaders, thinking that this is an aberration and that if they could just get past the problem solving, they could get back to the comfort of decision making.
Great. So it has to become a way of life for the organization.
Fundamentally a way of life.
That's great. Steve, this has been tremendous. I know it's incredibly unfair to ask you to compress decades of work, and it's a large book, which I recommend people should go out and read. That really goes into much more detail about these examples and Steve's responses to them. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to many of the questions that were coming through, but we will be following up with a message after this webinar, so watch out for that. And with that, it just remains for me to thank you very much, Steve. And in our last few seconds, if there's one key takeaway that you think people should really, when they switch off their computer and turn back to their desk or whatever else they're doing right now, what would that be?
Yes, so when you shut this off, you're going to turn around to your workspace and discover that there's a whole lot of stuff you got to get done today. And what I encourage you to do is, as you worry about getting that stuff done, keep track of what makes it hard to get that stuff done. And before you leave your work site today, be it an office, a hospital, a factory, a design studio, whatever it is, have one thing you're going to do differently tomorrow that'll give you back time. And if you do that today and you do it tomorrow and the day after, you do it not only at the end of the day but at lunch break too, guaranteed within a week things will be a little bit easier. If you can start doing that over the course of a month, things will be a lot easier for you. And over the course of 2 months, if you can start teaching your colleagues to also leave at the end of the day with the conviction to do something differently tomorrow based on a difficulty today, you too will have the opportunity to work with less effort to create far more value, which is appreciated by others, than you're doing right now.
Thank you, Steve. Seems like a great lesson for all of us. And with that, thank you all very much for logging in and calling in and joining us for this first webinar. We'll be in touch. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all our participants for joining us today. We hope you found this webcast presentation informative. This does conclude our webcast. You may now disconnect. Have a good day.